At the neighborhood barbecue, my husband Orlando stood up in front of 30 neighbors and announced that I was mentally unstable and needed to be committed for everyone's safety. But when I calmly pulled out my phone and hit record, his confident smirk vanished as I said the words that would destroy his life. "That's interesting, Orlando, because I've been recording everything for the past 2 years." The email notification glowed on my laptop screen like a digital bomb waiting to explode. Willowbrook Community Newsletter. Final draft ready for your approval. My finger hovered over the mouse as I stared at the headline I'd crafted so carefully. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Local real estate agent's secret life, financial fraud, infidelity, and the neighbor who documented it all. 2 years of planning. 2 years of meticulous documentation. 2 years of playing the perfect, naive wife while my husband Orlando Arlington systematically destroyed our neighbors' lives for his own profit. But tonight, at the annual Willowbrook Estates summer barbecue, everything would change. I closed my laptop and walked to the bathroom where Orlando was getting ready, his reflection in the mirror showing that same arrogant confidence that had fooled our entire neighborhood. At 35, he still had the boyish charm that had attracted me 7 years ago, but now I saw it for what it really was. A weapon he wielded against anyone who trusted him. "Ready for tonight, sweetheart?" he asked, adjusting his polo shirt collar. The same polo shirt he'd worn to seduce 3 different women on our street while telling them their marriages were failing and he could help them start over. "More ready than you know," I replied, applying my lipstick with steady hands. In the mirror, I caught his eyes and smiled. The same smile I'd perfected while secretly photographing his fake property assessments, recording his phone calls with his criminal associates, and documenting every lie he'd told our neighbors. Orlando had no idea that his wife Bonnie wasn't just a freelance graphic designer working from home. He didn't know that for the past 2 years, I'd been the anonymous editor and publisher of the Willowbrook Community Newsletter, a digital publication that had grown from a small neighborhood blog to a widely read local news source with over 15,000 subscribers across 3 zip codes. He certainly didn't know that tonight's special edition was already queued up on my publishing platform, waiting for one final click to send his carefully constructed world crashing down. "The Sinclairs are excited about tonight," Orlando said, checking his watch. "Dexter mentioned they're finally ready to move forward with selling their house." I nodded, remembering the conversation I'd overheard 3 weeks ago when Orlando thought I was grocery shopping. He'd been on the phone with his partner Marlon Holloway, discussing how they plan to pressure the Sinclairs into a quick sale at 30% below market value by fabricating neighborhood safety concerns. The same scheme they'd used on 4 other families in the past 18 months. "I'm sure they are," I said, thinking about the folder of evidence I'd compiled on Orlando's illegal real estate manipulation ring. Bank records showing kickbacks from predatory lenders, text messages coordinating fake property inspections, photos of Orlando with the married women he'd manipulated into believing their homes were worthless, while he privately arranged to purchase them through shell companies. The Sinclairs were just the latest targets in a pattern I'd been tracking since I first became suspicious of Orlando's sudden increase in income. Bernadette Sinclair had confided in me just last week about the safety issues Orlando claimed to have discovered in their neighborhood, issues that mysteriously disappeared from public records whenever I tried to verify them. As Orlando headed downstairs to load the car with his contribution to the barbecue, I opened my laptop one final time. The newsletter was perfection, 23 pages of meticulously documented evidence, supported by photographs, audio recordings, and financial records that painted a complete picture of Orlando's criminal enterprise. But the real masterpiece was the final section, a message from your neighbor. My first-person account of discovering my husband's crimes, written in my own voice for the first time. No more anonymous reporting. Tonight, Bonnie Arlington would step out of the shadows and reveal not just Orlando's crimes, but my own role in exposing them. The barbecue was scheduled to start at 6 p.m. in the Willowbrook Estates Community Park. By 7 p.m., when Orlando traditionally gave his annual State of the Neighborhood presentation to the assembled residents, I would have already triggered the newsletter's automatic distribution to every email address in our community database. 15,000 subscribers would receive the explosive exposés simultaneously. Local news outlets that had been following my newsletter would get the story. The Real Estate Licensing Board would get their copy. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit would get theirs. But first, I wanted to see Orlando's face when he realized that his perfect wife had become his perfect nightmare. I saved the newsletter file and closed my laptop, then walked to our bedroom closet where I kept my real insurance policy. Behind a panel that Orlando had never noticed, I stored backup drives containing additional evidence, a second laptop, and 3 separate recording devices. Everything was encrypted, backed up to secure cloud storage, and programmed to automatically release if anything happened to me. Orlando thought he was the smartest person in every room. He thought his charm and manipulation skills made him untouchable. He thought his wife was too naive and trusting to ever discover his secrets. Tonight he would learn how wrong he was about everything. Tuane. The sound of our car horn honking outside told me it was time to go. I grabbed my purse, checked that my phone was fully charged and set to record, and took one last look in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked exactly like the devoted wife Orlando expected to see. But inside, I was someone completely different. Someone who had spent 2 years becoming an expert in financial fraud investigation. Someone who had learned to lip read so I could understand Orlando's whispered phone conversations. Someone who had taught herself advanced photography techniques to document evidence from a distance. Someone who had been planning this moment for so long that every detail was already locked in place. As I walked downstairs to join Orlando for what would be his last community barbecue as a free man, I felt a calm certainty wash over me. Everything was ready. The evidence was bulletproof. The timing was perfect. Orlando was about to become the most famous resident of Willowbrook Estates, just not in the way he'd always imagined. The drive to the community park took 12 minutes. I spent every one of them thinking about the faces of our neighbors when they realized who had been living among them, and more importantly, who had been protecting them all along. Tonight, the quiet wife sitting in the passenger seat would become the most talked about woman in town. And Orlando Arlington would discover that sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is the one who destroys you completely. My name is Bonnie Arlington, and if you asked any of my neighbors in Willowbrook Estates to describe me, they'd probably say I was the quiet one. The wife who smiled politely at community meetings, brought homemade cookies to new residents, and seemed perfectly content to let her successful husband handle all the important neighborhood business. They wouldn't be entirely wrong. That version of me did exist. But what none of them knew, including Orlando, was that I had been living a carefully constructed double life for the past 2 years. By day, I was exactly what everyone expected. A freelance graphic designer who worked from our converted home office, took online yoga classes, and spent my afternoons tending to the small garden behind our colonial-style house on Maple Drive. I attended book club meetings with the other wives, participated in the annual charity drives, and never missed a community social event. But by night, and during every moment Orlando thought I was busy with mundane domestic tasks, I had been building something far more significant than anyone could imagine. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just any suburban neighborhood. Developed in the early 2000s as a premium community, it housed approximately 200 families in a carefully planned grid of tree-lined streets. Property values averaged between $400,000 and $600,000, making it one of the most desirable areas in our mid-sized city of Millbrook. The community prided itself on exclusivity and high standards. We had our own homeowners association, complete with architectural review committees and landscaping requirements. We had a private community center with a pool, tennis courts, and meeting spaces. Most importantly, we had a tight-knit social structure where reputation and appearances mattered more than almost anything else. Orlando had positioned himself at the center of this social ecosystem from the moment we moved here 5 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As a licensed real estate agent with connections throughout the region, he quickly became the go-to person for property advice, market insights, and neighborhood leadership. Within 2 years, he was elected to the Homeowners Association board. Within 3, he was practically running it. Everyone loved Orlando Arlington. He was charming, knowledgeable, and always ready to help a neighbor with property concerns or market questions. He organized community events, mediated disputes, and seemed genuinely invested in maintaining Willowbrook's prestigious reputation. What they didn't see was the man I lived with behind closed doors. The Orlando I knew was calculating, manipulative, and obsessed with money and status. He viewed our neighbors not as friends or community members, but as opportunities to be exploited. Every conversation he had, every favor he offered, every piece of advice he gave, was part of a larger strategy to benefit himself financially. I first began to suspect something was wrong 18 months after we moved to Willowbrook. Orlando's income had suddenly increased dramatically, but his client roster didn't seem to justify the change. He was making large cash deposits that he claimed were commission payments, but the timing never aligned with any sales I knew about. Then there were the private phone calls, conversations he would take in his car or in the basement, speaking in hushed tones about target properties and motivated sellers. When I asked about them, he would dismiss my questions with vague explanations about business strategy and market research. The turning point came 2 years ago, when our neighbors, the Kramers, abruptly moved away after living on Willowbrook Drive for less than 6 months. They had been a young couple, both teachers who had saved for years to afford their dream home in our community. Then suddenly, they were gone, and Orlando had somehow facilitated the sale of their house to an investment company for significantly less than they had paid for it. When I asked Orlando about it, he explained that the Kramers had encountered unexpected financial difficulties and needed to sell quickly. He had helped them find a buyer willing to close fast, even if it meant taking a loss. It was a favor to distressed neighbors, he said. But something about his explanation felt rehearsed, too smooth, too convenient. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I decided to investigate my own husband. I started small. I began paying closer attention to his phone calls, his schedule, his unexplained absences. I started a private document on my computer, where I tracked unusual financial activity and inconsistencies in his stories. I began taking note of which neighbors he spent time with, and what happened to their property situations afterward. What I discovered was a pattern of predatory behavior that was both more sophisticated and more extensive than I had imagined. Orlando wasn't just a real estate agent helping neighbors with property transactions. He was running a complex scheme designed to manipulate vulnerable homeowners into selling their properties below market value to a network of investors he worked with. The scheme involved everything from fabricated property assessments to manufactured neighborhood safety concerns, to elaborate emotional manipulation of families going through difficult times. The Willowbrook Community Newsletter had started as my way of documenting and understanding what Orlando was doing. Initially, it was just a private blog where I could organize my research and track patterns in his behavior. But as I gathered more evidence and realized the scope of his operation, I began to see the potential for something much more powerful. If I could build a legitimate community news platform, I would have the perfect cover for investigating Orlando's activities. I could interview neighbors under the pretense of community journalism. I could request public records as a member of the media. I could attend city planning meetings and homeowners association gatherings with official justification for asking detailed questions. Most importantly, I could build an audience of local residents who would trust the newsletter as a reliable source of community information. When the time came to expose Orlando's crimes, I would have a platform that could reach not just our immediate neighbors, but thousands of residents across multiple communities who might be facing similar predatory schemes. The newsletter had grown far beyond my original expectations. What started as a simple community blog had evolved into a professionally designed digital publication, with investigative reporting, local business features, and comprehensive coverage of municipal government activities. I had developed sources in City Hall, the police department, and various local businesses. I had built relationships with other journalists and established credibility with local news outlets, all while maintaining my cover as Orlando's devoted wife, who spent her days designing marketing materials for small businesses, and her evenings cooking dinner and discussing neighborhood gossip. The irony wasn't lost on me that Orlando, who prided himself on reading people and understanding their motivations, had completely failed to recognize what was happening in his own home. The woman he dismissed as a naive creative type had become an investigative journalist capable of dismantling his entire criminal enterprise. Tonight at the community barbecue, that carefully maintained double life would finally come to an end. What Orlando didn't know What none of them knew was that the Willowbrook Community Newsletter had become far more than a simple neighborhood publication. Over the past 2 years, it had evolved into something that would have shocked everyone who thought they knew Quiet Bonnie Arlington. The newsletter now reached 15,847 subscribers across 7 different communities. It had broken 3 major municipal corruption stories that were picked up by the regional newspaper. 2 city council members had resigned after my investigations into their illegal business dealings. The mayor's office returned my calls within hours. Yeah, I had press credentials. I had sources in law enforcement. I had a direct line to the FBI's white-collar crime division. But more importantly, I had something that would destroy Orlando completely. Irrefutable evidence of a criminal conspiracy that stretched far beyond our pretty neighborhood streets. Every morning while Orlando showered and prepared for work, I would retreat to what he thought was my simple home office. The room looked exactly like what you'd expect from a freelance graphic designer. Dual monitors, a high-end printer, shelves lined with design books and client folders. But behind a false panel I'd installed in the built-in desk, I kept the real tools of my trade: professional-grade recording equipment, telephoto camera lenses, financial analysis software, 3 different encrypted hard drives containing terabytes of evidence, a second laptop that Orlando had never seen, connected to a secure network that routed through multiple VPN servers. I had become an expert in forensic accounting, learning to trace complex financial transactions through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts. I had studied real estate law, consumer protection regulations, and federal fraud statutes. I had taken online courses in investigative journalism and digital security. The woman Orlando married, the one who used to ask him to explain our tax returns because numbers made her head spin, had taught herself to read financial statements like novels. The breakthrough had come 8 months ago when I finally gained access to Orlando's private email account. Not through hacking or any dramatic computer intrusion, but through something much simpler. I noticed he always used the same password pattern for everything, and I observed him entering it enough times to figure out his system. What I found in those emails was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Orlando wasn't working alone. He was part of a network that included Marlon Holloway, a mortgage broker who specialized in predatory lending, Eric Sinclair, a home inspector who would fabricate structural problems, and Amber Holloway, a city planning office employee who provided inside information about upcoming zoning changes and development projects. Together, they had developed a sophisticated system for identifying vulnerable homeowners and manipulating them into desperate sales situations. Orlando would target families going through divorces, job losses, medical emergencies, or other financial stress. He would befriend them, gain their trust, and then gradually convince them that their only option was to sell quickly, even at a significant loss. The emails revealed the chilling efficiency of their operation. They had code names for different types of targets: bleeding hearts for families with medical bills, broken birds for divorce situations, dead branches for elderly homeowners they considered easy marks. They would create artificial urgency through manufactured crises. Eric would conduct fake inspections that revealed emergency structural issues requiring immediate expensive repairs. Amber would hint at upcoming city projects that would negatively impact property values. Marlon would suddenly discover problems with existing mortgages that required immediate action. Once the homeowners were sufficiently panicked, Orlando would swoop in with a solution: an investor friend who could close quickly and save them from financial ruin. The homeowners, grateful for the rescue, would accept offers that were typically 20 to 40% below market value. What they didn't know was that the investor was actually a shell company controlled by the network. The properties would be minimally repaired and resold within 6 months at market value, generating enormous profits that were split among the conspirators. Over the past 3 years, they had executed this scheme on at least 27 families that I could document. The total amount stolen from these families exceeded $2 million. But the financial fraud was only part of this story. The emails also revealed Orlando's systematic seduction of lonely wives whose marriages were struggling. He would identify women in vulnerable emotional states, offer them sympathy and attention, and then gradually convince them that their husbands were the source of their problems. He had detailed notes on each woman's psychological profile, their marriage issues, their financial situations, and their sexual preferences. He kept spreadsheets tracking which women were most likely to leave their husbands, which ones had access to significant assets, and which ones might be useful in other ways. 3 women had already divorced their husbands after affairs with Orlando. 2 had sold their homes through him during the divorce proceedings. 1 had provided him with inside information about her husband's business that he had used to manipulate property deals in that sector. Kayla Sinclair, Dexter's wife, was his current primary target. The emails showed that Orlando had been working on her for 6 months, gradually convincing her that Dexter was holding her back professionally and personally. He had convinced her that their house was in a, quote, declining area, and that she should pressure Dexter to sell before values dropped further. What made it even more sinister was that Orlando documented everything. Photos, videos, audio recordings. He kept detailed records of his sexual encounters and emotional manipulations, apparently as insurance against the women or blackmail material for future use. I had all of it. Every email, every photo, every recorded conversation. 2 years of meticulous evidence gathering had given me a complete picture of a criminal enterprise that was destroying families and stealing people's life savings. But Orlando's greatest mistake was underestimating the woman he went to bed with every night, Heaven. He thought I was decorative, harmless, too focused on my little design projects to pay attention to important things like business and money. He made phone calls in front of me because he assumed I wouldn't understand what he was discussing. He left documents lying around because he believed I lacked the intelligence to interpret them. He never suspected that the community newsletter he occasionally praised as surprisingly professional for a neighborhood blog was researched, written, edited, and published by his own wife. He didn't know that the, quote, graphic design clients I claimed to be meeting with were actually sources providing me with additional information about his activities. He didn't realize that my yoga classes were actually meetings with federal investigators who had been building their own case against his network. Most importantly, he had no idea that tonight's community barbecue was going to be the final chapter in the most comprehensive takedown of a suburban criminal conspiracy that Millbrook had ever seen. The Willowbrook Community Newsletter's special edition was already uploaded to the server, scheduled for automatic distribution at exactly 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes after Orlando traditionally began his annual State of the Neighborhood presentation. By 7:30, every subscriber would have the complete story. By 8 o'clock, it would be trending on social media. By 9 o'clock, local news crews would be on their way to Willowbrook Estates. Orlando thought tonight was going to be another opportunity to manipulate and control. Instead, it was going to be the night that quiet, harmless Bonnie Arlington revealed herself as the most dangerous person he had ever underestimated. Orlando Arlington wasn't born a monster. He had carefully crafted himself into one. At 35, he possessed the kind of effortless charm that made people want to trust him within minutes of meeting him. Tall and athletic, with perfectly styled dark hair and a smile that seemed genuine until you learned to recognize the calculation behind it, Orlando had spent years perfecting the art of making people feel special while he systematically destroyed their lives. His real estate license hung prominently in our home office, along with awards for Salesperson of the Year and Community Leadership Excellence. What visitors didn't see were the meticulous files he kept on every neighbor, documenting their financial situations, marriage problems, and psychological vulnerabilities. Orlando approached neighborhood relationships like a chess master planning moves 20 steps ahead. Every conversation was strategic. Every favor came with invisible strings attached. Every piece of advice was designed to create dependence and leverage future opportunities. I had watched him work his magic countless times, and the precision was both impressive and terrifying. Take the Henderson family, who lived 3 houses down from us on Maple Drive. When Tom Henderson lost his job at the manufacturing plant 18 months ago, Orlando was the first neighbor to offer support. He brought over dinner invitations, helped Tom with his resume, and even connected him with potential employers through his quote, business network. What Tom didn't know was that Orlando had advanced knowledge of the plant closure through his connection with Amber Holloway in city planning. While Tom was struggling to find new employment, Orlando was already positioning himself to benefit from the inevitable financial crisis. Over the course of 6 months, Orlando gradually convinced Tom that the job market was worse than it appeared, that his savings wouldn't last as long as he hoped, and that the smart move would be to downsize before he was forced into foreclosure. He recommended Eric Sinclair as a trusted inspector who could identify any issues that might complicate a future sale. Eric's inspection revealed, quote, serious foundation problems that would cost at least $40,000 to repair, problems that were either grossly exaggerated or completely fabricated. Faced with the choice between expensive repairs and a quick sale, Tom chose to sell. Orlando's investor friend purchased the Henderson house for $220,000, nearly $70,000 below its actual market value. 3 months later, after minimal cosmetic improvements, the same house sold for $310,000. Tom Henderson moved his family to a smaller apartment across town, believing he had narrowly avoided financial disaster. Orlando collected a $28,000 commission from the transaction, plus his share of the profits from the resale. But Orlando's manipulation extended far beyond financial exploitation. He had an even more sinister talent for identifying and exploiting emotional vulnerabilities. Rebecca Walsh lived alone in the corner house on Birch Lane after her husband died of cancer 2 years ago. At 63, she was struggling with grief, loneliness, and the overwhelming responsibility of maintaining their large property by herself. Orlando positioned himself as the caring neighbor who understood her situation. He would stop by regularly to check on her, help with yard work, and listen to her talk about her late husband. He brought her groceries during snowstorms and invited her to community events where she might feel isolated. To everyone watching, including me initially, Orlando seemed like the model of neighborly compassion. What I discovered through his emails was that every gesture of kindness was calculated to build trust and emotional dependence. Orlando kept detailed notes about Rebecca's emotional state, her medication schedule, her financial concerns, and her family relationships. He knew exactly when she was most vulnerable and would time his visits accordingly. Gradually, he began planting seeds of doubt about her ability to maintain the house. He pointed out maintenance issues that were getting worse, mentioned how property values in the area might be declining, and suggested that the stress of homeownership might be impacting her health. When Rebecca began talking about possibly selling, Orlando was ready with the perfect solution. He knew a buyer who specialized in helping seniors transition to more manageable living situations. The buyer would handle all the paperwork, cover the closing costs, and even help arrange her move to a nice senior community. Rebecca sold her house for $180,000, grateful for Orlando's help in making the process so easy. The house was worth at least $260,000. She used most of the proceeds to pay for her move to an assisted living facility, believing she had made a smart financial decision. Orlando's share of that transaction was over $15,000. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Orlando's operation was how he manipulated the wives of his targets. He had developed a systematic approach to identifying women in troubled marriages and exploiting their emotional needs to advance his financial schemes. His emails contained detailed psychological profiles of dozens of women in our community. He categorized them by their marriage satisfaction levels, their financial access, their susceptibility to flattery, and their likelihood to engage in extramarital affairs. He would identify women whose husbands traveled frequently, worked long hours, or seemed emotionally distant. He would find excuses to spend time with them, helping with home repairs, offering real estate advice, or simply being available to listen when they needed to talk. Orlando was a master of making women feel seen and appreciated in ways their husbands had stopped providing. He would remember details about their interests, compliment them on things their husbands took for granted, and gradually position himself as the man who truly understood them. The seduction was always gradual and seemingly reluctant on his part. He would create situations where emotional intimacy seemed to develop naturally, where the women felt like they were pursuing him rather than being manipulated. He documented every step of the process, keeping records of what worked with each personality type. Once he had established control, Orlando would begin influencing their decisions about property and finances. He would convince them that their marriages were holding them back, that their husbands didn't appreciate their true worth, and that they deserved better lives. 3 divorces in our neighborhood could be directly traced to Orlando's interventions. In each case, He had profited from the resulting property transactions, while destroying families and leaving children caught in the aftermath of his manipulation. The most chilling aspect of Orlando's personality was his complete lack of empathy for his victims. His emails discussed the families he was destroying with the same clinical detachment other people might use to talk about stock investments or sports statistics. He referred to Tom Henderson as broken merchandise after the job loss. Rebecca Walsh was inventory to be liquidated. The women he seduced were assets to be leveraged for maximum return. Orlando didn't see neighbors. He saw opportunities. He didn't see families. He saw revenue streams. He didn't see human suffering. He saw market inefficiencies to be exploited. And for 2 years, I had been living with this predator, sharing meals with him, sleeping beside him, all while he destroyed the lives of people who trusted him. People who invited us to their birthday parties, who watched our house when we traveled, who considered us friends. Liu. Tonight, Orlando would discover that his greatest miscalculation wasn't underestimating his victim's intelligence or resilience. It was underestimating his wife. The true cost of Orlando's crimes couldn't be measured in dollars alone. Behind every fraudulent transaction was a family whose life had been permanently altered, children whose security had been shattered, and dreams that had been systematically destroyed by a man they trusted as a friend. I kept detailed files on each victim, not just for evidence purposes, but because I needed to understand the full scope of the devastation Orlando had caused. These weren't just names and financial records. They were real people whose stories haunted me every time I looked at my husband across the dinner table. The Martinez family had been Orlando's most heartbreaking target. Rosa Martinez was battling breast cancer when Orlando first approached them, with concerns about their property taxes increasing due to a reassessment error that he claimed to have discovered. While Rosa was undergoing chemotherapy, her husband Carlos was juggling medical bills, childcare for their 2 young daughters, and a construction job that barely covered their mounting expenses. Orlando convinced them that the city was planning to significantly increase property taxes on their street within the next year, and that they should consider selling before the financial burden became unmanageable. He painted a picture of inevitable foreclosure and financial ruin if they tried to hold on to their home while dealing with Rosa's medical costs. What Carlos didn't know was that Orlando had fabricated the entire tax reassessment story. There were no planned increases, no clerical errors, no looming financial disaster beyond the medical bills they were already managing. Orlando had simply identified a family in crisis and manufactured additional pressure to force a desperate sale. The Martinez house sold for $195,000. Its actual value was $270,000. That $75,000 difference represented Rosa's college fund, the girls' future educational opportunities, and the financial security that might have helped them weather her cancer treatment without losing their home. 6 months after the sale, Rosa's cancer went into remission. By then, the family was renting a cramped apartment across town, the girls had been forced to change schools, and Carlos was working double shifts to cover rent that was higher than their previous mortgage payments. They had been convinced they were making a smart decision to avoid financial catastrophe, never knowing that the catastrophe itself had been orchestrated by their trusted neighbor. 8-year-old Sofia Martinez asked her mother why they had to move away from their pretty house with the big backyard. Rosa didn't know how to explain that they had been lied to by someone they considered a friend. Then there was elderly William Chen, a widower who had lived in Willowbrook Estates since the community was first developed. At 78, William struggled with early-stage dementia, but was determined to remain in the home he had shared with his late wife Margaret for 15 years. Orlando identified William as what he called in his emails a declining asset, someone whose cognitive issues made him particularly vulnerable to manipulation and pressure tactics. Over the course of 8 months, Orlando systematically isolated William from his adult children who lived in other states, convincing him that they were trying to take control of his finances and force him into a nursing home. Orlando became William's primary source of advice and support, helping him with grocery shopping, medication management, and household maintenance. William grew to depend on Orlando completely, viewing him as the only person who truly understood his desire to maintain his independence. Gradually, Orlando began suggesting that William's house was becoming too much for him to handle safely. He arranged for Eric Sinclair to conduct a quote safety inspection that revealed numerous hazards requiring expensive modifications. The cost of making the house safe for an elderly resident would be prohibitive, Orlando explained. The responsible choice would be to sell and move to a more manageable living situation. Yawneed House. William's house sold for $230,000, with Orlando arranging for the buyer to cover all closing costs and even helping William move to what was described as a, quote, luxury senior community. William was grateful for Orlando's assistance in making such a difficult transition easier. The house was actually worth $320,000. The luxury senior community was a basic assisted living facility that consumed most of William's sale proceeds within 18 months. His adult children, who had been trying to coordinate better care options for their father, discovered the sale only after it was finalized. William died 14 months later, confused and alone, his financial resources depleted, and his family relationships destroyed by Orlando's systematic manipulation of his deteriorating mental state. But perhaps the most devastating collateral damage was what Orlando's schemes did to marriages throughout our community. Jennifer Walsh, who lived on Birch Lane with her husband Michael and their teenage daughter, had been struggling with the isolation of being a stay-at-home mother after 15 years of marriage. Michael worked long hours as an engineer, often traveling for weeks at a time, leaving Jennifer to manage their household and their daughter's busy schedule alone. Orlando identified Jennifer's loneliness and gradually positioned himself as the sympathetic friend who understood her frustration. He would stop by when Michael was traveling, ostensibly to check on their property security, but really to provide Jennifer with the attention and conversation she craved. Over several months, Orlando convinced Jennifer that Michael was deliberately neglecting her emotional needs, that her marriage was preventing her from reaching her full potential, and that she deserved a partner who truly appreciated her intelligence and beauty. The affair lasted 6 months. When Jennifer finally told Michael she wanted a divorce, Orlando was ready with property advice that would help her get what she deserved in the settlement. The family home sold during the divorce proceedings, with Orlando facilitating a sale that netted Michael and Jennifer significantly less than market value, while generating substantial commissions for himself. 16-year-old Ashley Walsh watched her parents' marriage implode, never knowing that the family friend who had destroyed her parents' trust in each other had also stolen nearly $60,000 from their property sale. She blamed herself for her parents' problems, believing that the stress of raising a teenager had somehow caused their relationship to fail. Jennifer moved to a smaller house across town, still believing that Orlando had helped her escape an unfulfilling marriage. She had no idea that her emotional liberation had been systematically engineered by a predator who saw her marital dissatisfaction as a business opportunity. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern that had been repeating throughout our community for 3 years, with Orlando leaving a trail of broken families, depleted savings accounts, and shattered trust in his wake. Tonight, every single victim would learn the truth about what had really happened to them. And Orlando would finally face the consequences of treating human lives as profit margins in his personal financial empire. Building a case against someone you live with requires a level of deception and patience that I never knew I possessed. For 2 years, I had been living like a spy in my own home, carefully documenting every conversation, every phone call, every piece of evidence that would eventually destroy the man I shared a bed with each night. The technical challenges alone were staggering. Orlando was naturally suspicious and controlling, the kind of person who checked browser histories and noticed when objects in his office had been moved even slightly. I had to become an expert in digital forensics and surveillance techniques, while maintaining the facade of a technologically naive wife who needed help setting up her email account. My breakthrough came when I realized that Orlando's greatest weakness was his arrogance. He was so convinced of his intellectual superiority that he never considered the possibility that I might be capable of outsmarting him. This blind spot became the foundation of my entire investigation strategy. I started with the most basic technique: listening. Orlando conducted many of his criminal conversations in our home, usually in his office with the door closed, believing that his quiet voice and my apparent disinterest in his business affairs provided adequate security. What he didn't know was that I had been training myself to read lips by watching his reflection in the window behind his desk. Over several months, I became proficient enough to understand most of his phone conversations even when I couldn't hear the audio. I kept detailed notes of every conversation I observed, gradually building a comprehensive picture of his network and their methods. The next challenge was gaining access to his digital communications. Orlando kept his computer password protected and his phone secured with biometric locks. Direct access seemed impossible until I realized that he followed predictable patterns in all his security measures. I spent weeks observing how he entered passwords, noting finger positions and timing patterns. Orlando used variations of the same base password for everything, typically incorporating dates that were significant to him personally. Once I identified the pattern, accessing his accounts became a matter of systematic testing during the brief windows when he was showering or working in the yard. But obtaining access was only the beginning. I needed to document everything in a way that would be legally admissible and professionally credible. I taught myself to use screenshot software that captured not just images but metadata proving authenticity. I learned about digital chain of custody requirements and evidence preservation protocols. Every email I discovered was carefully photographed with timestamp verification. Every financial document was copied and cross-referenced with public records. Every audio recording was made using equipment that produced files with embedded authentication markers. The physical evidence required even more creativity. Orlando kept hard copies of sensitive documents in a locked filing cabinet in our basement office. The cabinet appeared to use a standard combination lock, but my attempts to guess the combination based on significant dates failed repeatedly. The solution came from an unexpected source. Our cleaning lady mentioned that Orlando always seemed nervous about her working in the basement, specifically asking her to avoid dusting near his filing cabinet. I realized he might be hiding the combination somewhere nearby rather than memorizing it. After careful observation, I discovered that Orlando had written the combination in pencil on the underside of his desk drawer, visible only when the drawer was fully extended. The combination was changed monthly, but always followed the same pattern of significant dates from his life. Once I gained access to the filing cabinet, I found the physical contracts, property records, and financial statements that corroborated everything I had discovered in his digital communications. More importantly, I found handwritten notes that provided insight into his psychological manipulation techniques and target selection criteria. Orlando kept what he called opportunity assessments for every family in our neighborhood. These files contained detailed information about each household's financial situation, relationship dynamics, and potential vulnerabilities. He had credit reports that he had obtained illegally, medical information gathered through casual conversations, and even photographs taken without the subject's knowledge. The files revealed the systematic nature of his operations. He would spend months studying potential targets before making initial contact. He maintained detailed timelines of each family's financial and emotional stress points. He had contingency plans for different scenarios and backup targets if primary opportunities fell through. Perhaps most disturbing were his conversion notes, detailed records of how he had successfully manipulated specific individuals. These read like instruction manuals for psychological manipulation, with step-by-step accounts of which approaches worked best with different personality types. He documented how long it took to gain each victim's trust, which emotional triggers were most effective, and how to maintain control throughout the manipulation process. He had refined his techniques based on previous successes and failures, constantly improving his ability to exploit human psychology for financial gain. But Orlando's most critical mistake was his obsession with record-keeping. His criminal enterprise generated substantial income that needed to be tracked and laundered through legitimate channels. He kept meticulous financial records that documented every transaction, every commission, and every profit distribution among his network members. These records, combined with his correspondence and victim files, created a complete picture of a criminal conspiracy that exceeded anything I had initially suspected. The scope of the operation, the number of victims, and the sophistication of the methods involved made this a federal case rather than simple local fraud. As my evidence collection expanded, I realized I needed professional guidance to ensure everything would be legally admissible and strategically effective. Through my newsletter connections, I had developed relationships with investigative journalists and law enforcement officials who could provide expert advice without compromising the investigation. Working with these contacts, I learned to properly preserve digital evidence, maintain chain of custody documentation, and organize complex financial data in ways that would be comprehensible to prosecutors and juries. I developed secure communication protocols and backup storage systems that would protect the evidence, even if Orlando discovered my investigation. By the time I was ready for tonight's confrontation, I had assembled over 3,000 individual pieces of evidence spanning Orlando's entire criminal career. Every victim's story was documented with multiple sources of verification. Every financial transaction was traced through multiple accounts and shell companies. Tonight's newsletter publication would be the culmination of the most thorough investigation of suburban financial fraud that our community had ever seen. And Orlando would finally discover that his greatest victim had been gathering the evidence that would destroy him completely. The annual Willowbrook Estates Summer Barbecue was Orlando's favorite day of the year. His opportunity to hold court in front of the entire community, while positioning himself as the neighborhood's unofficial leader and primary source of wisdom about property values and community development. For the past 4 years, Orlando had used this event to launch his most ambitious manipulation campaigns. The relaxed social atmosphere, combined with alcohol and the natural tendency for neighbors to discuss their personal situations, created perfect conditions for him to identify new targets and plant seeds for future exploitation. This year's barbecue was scheduled to be his crowning achievement. Orlando had been planning his presentation for months, preparing what he called his State of Willowbrook address, a comprehensive overview of property values, community improvements, and opportunities that would require careful navigation with the right professional guidance. What Orlando didn't know was that I had been planning for this night even longer, and with far more precision than he could have imagined. The community park where the barbecue was held every year provided the perfect stage for what I had in mind. The pavilion's elevated platform gave speakers a clear view of the entire gathering, while the natural amphitheater seating arrangement ensured that everyone present would have an unobstructed view of the events that were about to unfold. More importantly, the pavilion was equipped with a professional sound system and large screens that Orlando had requested for his presentation. What he hadn't considered was that those same screens could be used to display other types of information, like detailed financial records, email correspondences, and victim impact statements. I had spent the morning making final preparations, uploading the newsletter's special edition to the server, and programming the automatic distribution system that would send it to over 15,000 subscribers at exactly 7:15 p.m. But the digital publication was only one part of tonight's revelation. Working through my contacts in local journalism, I had arranged for 3 different news crews to be positioned around the community park, ostensibly covering the charming community tradition of Willowbrook's annual barbecue. They had no idea they were about to witness the exposure of one of the region's most sophisticated fraud operations. I had also coordinated with federal investigators who would be present in plainclothes, ready to take Orlando and his co-conspirators into custody once the evidence was made public. The timing had to be perfect, dramatic enough to ensure maximum impact, but controlled enough to protect the safety of everyone present. Orlando was practically vibrating with excitement as we prepared to leave for the park. He had rehearsed his presentation dozens of times, fine-tuning every pause and gesture for maximum persuasive impact. His slides were arranged to build toward what he called his big reveal, a detailed analysis of upcoming development projects that would affect property values throughout the community. What Orlando planned to present as insider knowledge about profitable investment opportunities was actually information he had obtained illegally through Amber Holloway's position in city planning. His presentation was designed to panic homeowners about potential negative impacts while positioning himself as the expert who could help them navigate the challenges ahead. "Tonight's going to change everything," Orlando told me as he loaded his presentation materials into the car. "After people see what's coming, they'll understand why they need professional guidance to protect their investments." I nodded and smiled, carrying my own laptop bag that contained backup drives with enough evidence to send Orlando to federal prison for the next 20 years. "I'm sure it will be a night nobody forgets," I replied. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on me. Orlando was absolutely right that tonight would change everything. just not in the way he anticipated. As we drove toward the community park, Orlando continued outlining his strategy for the evening. He planned to start with general community updates, gradually building toward more serious discussions about property values and development concerns. The real manipulation would begin during the informal conversations after his presentation, when neighbors would be primed with anxiety about their financial security. "The key is timing," Orlando explained, as if he were sharing professional wisdom rather than describing criminal manipulation techniques. "You have to let people reach their own conclusions while gently guiding them toward the right decisions." I listened to him describe his planned psychological manipulation of our neighbors, people who had invited us to their children's birthday parties, who had brought us casseroles when I had the flu, who trusted Orlando to have their best interests at heart. By 6 p.m., cars were already filling the parking area around the community park. I could see familiar faces setting up tables, arranging food contributions, and testing the sound system that would amplify Orlando's voice as he delivered what he believed would be his most successful manipulation campaign yet. What Orlando couldn't see were the federal agents positioning themselves throughout the crowd, the journalists preparing their equipment for what they had been told would be a, quote, significant community interest story, and the local police units stationed nearby in case crowd control became necessary. At 6:30, Orlando began his traditional pre-presentation networking, moving through the gathering with his characteristic charm and confidence. I watched him shake hands with Tom Henderson, whose family had lost their home to Orlando's manufactured crisis. I saw him embrace Rebecca Walsh, who had been pressured into selling her house while grieving her husband's death. Every person Orlando greeted had been victimized by his schemes, yet they all responded to him with genuine warmth and trust. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These good people had no idea they were embracing the predator who had systematically destroyed their financial security. At 7 p.m., Orlando took the stage to begin his presentation. The crowd settled into their seats, drinks in hand, prepared to listen to their trusted neighbor share his insights about their community's future. I sat in the front row, my phone recording everything, my laptop connected to the pavilion's Wi-Fi network, my finger hovering over the publish button that would send the special edition newsletter to thousands of subscribers in exactly 15 minutes. Orlando adjusted the microphone, smiled at his audience, and began to speak. "Good evening, neighbors and friends. Thank you all for coming to what I believe will be the most important community gathering in Willowbrook's history." He had no idea how right he was. The Willowbrook Estates Community Park had been transformed into what looked like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Families spread across picnic blankets, children chased fireflies in the gathering dusk, and neighbors who rarely spoke during their busy weekday routines now clustered together in animated conversation about property taxes, school board elections, and summer vacation plans. What made the scene particularly surreal was knowing that nearly every family present had been systematically victimized by the man currently holding court at the center of the pavilion, completely oblivious to the hatred that should have been directed at him. Tom and Sarah Henderson sat at a picnic table near the front, their 2 young daughters playing on the nearby playground equipment. Tom looked thinner than he had 18 months ago, the stress of his job loss and forced relocation evident in the lines around his eyes. Sarah kept glancing at their modest car parked among the BMWs and Mercedes, a visible reminder of how far their circumstances had fallen since Orlando's help with their property situation. Rebecca Walsh had arrived alone, as she did to every community event since her husband's death. At 63, she looked fragile in her carefully coordinated outfit, the kind of woman who still dressed up for social occasions even though she now lived in a cramped senior apartment across town. She sat slightly apart from the main groups, politely declining offers to join conversations, her isolation a direct result of Orlando's manipulation during her most vulnerable period. The Martinez family had driven back from their small apartment across town specifically for tonight's barbecue, Rosa's cancer treatment, having been successful enough that she felt strong enough to attend community events again. Their girls, now 10 and 12, seemed quieter than they had been when they lived in Willowbrook, the disruption of forced relocation still evident in their subdued behavior around their former neighbors. Jennifer Walsh sat with her new boyfriend, a decent man who seemed genuinely committed to helping her rebuild her life after her divorce. Her daughter Ashley, now 17, stayed close to her mother's side, still struggling with trust issues that stemmed from watching her family implode 2 years earlier. Neither of them knew that the friendly neighbor who had helped Jennifer through her marital difficulties had actually orchestrated the entire crisis for his own financial benefit. Scattered throughout the gathering were Orlando's current targets, families he was actively working to destabilize and exploit. Dexter and Kayla Sinclair sat together, but the tension between them was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Orlando had been whispering poison in Kayla's ear for months, convincing her that Dexter was holding her back professionally and that their house was in a declining neighborhood. The Patel family looked stressed and distracted, clearly dealing with some kind of financial pressure that the rest of the community wasn't aware of yet. Orlando had been helping them navigate what he claimed were complicated tax issues, but which I knew were completely fabricated problems designed to create panic and force a quick property sale. Even families who hadn't been directly targeted were dealing with the secondary effects of Orlando's schemes. Property values throughout Willowbrook had been artificially depressed by his systematic manipulation of the market. Neighbors who should have been building wealth through their home equity had instead watched their property values stagnate, while Orlando and his network profited from the chaos they created. As 7 p.m. approached, Orlando moved through the crowd with the confidence of a politician working a campaign event. He shook hands with victims whose lives he had destroyed, accepted compliments on his community leadership from families whose financial security he had systematically undermined, and soaked up praise for his real estate expertise from neighbors who had no idea they were applauding the architect of their own exploitation. The most disturbing aspect of watching Orlando work the crowd was seeing how genuinely people responded to him. There was no fake charm or forced smiles. Orlando possessed a natural charisma that made people feel valued and heard. He remembered details about their children's activities, asked thoughtful questions about their work situations, and offered helpful advice about everything from lawn care to vacation planning. This wasn't a cartoon villain twirling his mustache while plotting evil schemes. This was a master manipulator who had weaponized human connection itself, turning people's natural desire for community and friendship into a tool for their own destruction. I watched Bernadette Sinclair laugh at something Orlando said, not knowing that he had detailed files documenting her marriage problems, her medication schedule, and her vulnerability to romantic attention from men who seemed to understand her better than her husband did. I saw William Chen's adult son shake Orlando's hand gratefully, unaware that Orlando had systematically isolated his father from family support before stealing nearly $100,000 from the elderly man's estate. The federal agents I had coordinated with were positioned throughout the gathering, appearing to be ordinary community members enjoying a neighborhood barbecue. Agent Rivera sat with his family near the playground, keeping watch over the children's area. Agent Chen had positioned herself near the pavilion entrance, ready to control access if the situation became chaotic. Agent Holloway, sharing the same last name as one of Orlando's co-conspirators purely by coincidence, monitored the parking area to prevent any escape attempts. The 3 news crews were setting up their equipment around the pavilion's perimeter, their presence explained as coverage of Willowbrook's model community engagement. Local politicians often attended these events, and the camera crews blended in naturally with the kind of positive community interest stories that filled local news broadcasts during the summer months. At 7:05 p.m., Orlando stepped up to the microphone for his sound check. The conversations throughout the park gradually quieted as neighbors turned their attention toward the pavilion. Children were called back from the playground to sit with their families. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the stage. I sat in the front row, my laptop open and connected to the park's Wi-Fi network, my phone fully charged and ready to record everything that was about to unfold. The newsletter's special edition was loaded in my publishing system, scheduled for automatic distribution in exactly 10 minutes. Behind me, I could hear the comfortable murmur of neighbors settling in for what they expected to be Orlando's annual presentation about property values and community development. Some were genuinely interested in his insights, while others attended mainly for the social aspect of the gathering. None of them suspected that they were about to witness the complete destruction of a criminal enterprise that had been operating in their midst for over 3 years. None of them knew that the trusted neighbor taking the stage was about to be exposed as one of the most sophisticated suburban predators their community had ever encountered. And none of them had any idea that the quiet woman sitting in the front row with her laptop was about to deliver the most devastating revelation in Willowbrook Estates' history. Orlando's voice carried across the park with the practiced authority of someone who had spent years positioning himself as the neighborhood's most trusted advisor. The wireless microphone gave his words a crisp clarity that reached every corner of the gathering, ensuring that not a single person would miss the performance he had been rehearsing for months. "Friends, neighbors, fellow Willowbrook residents," he began, his tone perfectly calibrated to convey both warmth and gravitas. "We gather here tonight not just to celebrate our community, but to discuss its future, and I'm afraid that future requires some difficult conversations about challenges ahead." The crowd settled into attentive silence, parents shushing children and conversations trailing off as Orlando commanded the pavilion like a seasoned politician. He wore his favorite navy blazer over khakis, the uniform of suburban authority that made him appear both approachable and professional. I watched from the front row as Orlando launched into what he called his State of Willowbrook presentation, clicking through professionally designed slides that displayed impressive charts, graphs, and aerial photographs of our community. Everything looked official, authoritative, and deeply researched. "Property values in our area have remained stable over the past year," Orlando announced, gesturing toward a colorful chart that showed modest appreciation rates. "However, several factors converging over the next 18 months will create unprecedented challenges for homeowners throughout our region." The first part of his presentation focused on legitimate market trends, interest rate fluctuations, regional employment data, and municipal budget concerns that were matters of public record. Orlando had always been skilled at mixing truth with manipulation, using accurate information to establish credibility before introducing his fabricated crises. Behind me, I could hear neighbors murmuring among themselves, as Orlando painted an increasingly ominous picture of economic headwinds that would affect their property investments. The psychological setup was masterful. Create anxiety about factors beyond their control, then position himself as the expert who could help them navigate the challenges. "Now, some of you may have heard rumors about upcoming development projects in our area," Orlando continued, his voice taking on the confidential tone of someone sharing insider knowledge. "I want to address these rumors directly, because accurate information is crucial for making sound financial decisions." This was where Orlando's presentation shifted from legitimate market analysis to criminal fraud. The slides that followed contained information that could only have been obtained through Amber Holloway's illegal access to city planning documents. Orlando was presenting confidential municipal information, as if it were publicly available knowledge. "The city is considering a significant rezoning initiative that would allow high-density housing development within a 2-mile radius of our community," Orlando announced, clicking to display a detailed map that highlighted Willowbrook's location relative to proposed development sites. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Property owners throughout the gathering shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging worried glances and whispered comments about potential impacts on their home values. Parents of school-aged children looked particularly concerned about increased traffic and population density. Additionally, Orlando continued, the municipal waste management facility currently located across town is being considered for relocation to a site approximately 1 mile from our eastern border. Environmental impact studies are still pending, but preliminary reports suggest significant concerns about groundwater contamination and air quality. This was completely fabricated. There were no waste facility relocation plans, no environmental impact studies, and no threats to air quality or groundwater in our area. Orlando was manufacturing environmental crises to panic homeowners into believing their properties were about to become worthless. Tom Henderson raised his hand from his seat near the front. "Orlando, where can we find these reports? I'd like to review the environmental data myself." Orlando's response was smooth and practiced. "The studies are still in preliminary phases, Tom. City planning isn't releasing details until the impact assessments are complete. But my sources in municipal government have given me advance access to help our community prepare for what's coming." The lies flowed effortlessly from Orlando's mouth, each fabrication delivered with the confidence of absolute truth. He presented himself as the concerned neighbor, who had obtained privileged information specifically to protect his friend's financial interests. "The timeline for these changes is aggressive," Orlando continued, clicking to a slide that showed a detailed calendar of supposed municipal deadlines. "Zoning committee votes are scheduled for early fall, with implementation beginning as soon as next spring. Property values in affected areas typically decline by 15 to 30% once development plans become public knowledge." I watched the faces around me drain of color as Orlando systematically terrorized our neighbors with fictional threats to their most significant financial assets. Elderly residents who depended on home equity for retirement security looked genuinely frightened. Young families who had stretched financially to afford Willowbrook homes appeared nauseated by the prospect of losing their investments. "However," Orlando said, his tone shifting to offer hope after manufacturing despair, "there are strategies for protecting your financial interests if you act quickly and decisively." This was the pivot point where Orlando would transition from fear-mongering to solution selling. He would spend the next several minutes positioning himself as the expert who could help families navigate these fabricated crises, setting up private consultations where he could apply more intensive pressure tactics. "Real estate markets are cyclical, and timing is crucial for maximizing your return on investment," Orlando explained, displaying charts that showed historical property appreciation rates. Families who recognize market shifts early and adapt their strategies accordingly can actually benefit from changes that devastate unprepared homeowners. The crowd was hanging on his every word now, desperately seeking guidance about threats that existed only in Orlando's imagination. He had created the perfect psychological conditions for mass manipulation: public anxiety about complex financial issues, combined with the promise of expert solutions from a trusted source. "I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting everyone needs to sell immediately," Orlando continued, though his tone implied exactly the opposite. "But families in certain situations, those dealing with job transitions, health concerns, retirement planning, or other financial pressures, may want to consider their options before market conditions become more challenging." He was identifying potential targets in real time, using public speaking as a screening mechanism to determine which families might be vulnerable to his manipulation techniques. The entire presentation was essentially a sales pitch disguised as community service. At 7:12 p.m., Orlando began wrapping up his formal presentation, preparing to transition into the informal consultation phase, where he would identify specific families for private follow-up conversations. This was when he typically scheduled the individual meetings that became intensive manipulation sessions. I checked my phone. 3 minutes until the newsletter's automatic publication would send Orlando's criminal history to over 15,000 subscribers simultaneously. Orlando had no idea that his greatest performance was about to become his final bow. Orlando's presentation reached its crescendo as he clicked to his final slide. A photograph of our beautiful neighborhood taken from above, with red circles marking homes where he claimed immediate action would be necessary to avoid financial catastrophe. "I know this information is concerning," Orlando said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone delivering difficult medicine to children. "But I want everyone to understand that knowledge is power. By being informed about these challenges early, our community has advantages that other neighborhoods won't have." What happened next was the moment I had been both dreading and anticipating for 2 years. Orlando's expression shifted as he looked directly at me in the front row, and his voice took on a more personal, almost intimate quality that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. "In fact, I think it's important for everyone to understand that not all of your neighbors have your best interests at heart." My blood went cold. This wasn't part of his planned presentation. "Some people in our community have been asking a lot of questions lately," Orlando continued, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that felt predatory. "Unusual questions about property records, financial transactions, and private business matters. Questions that suggest someone might be trying to interfere with legitimate efforts to help our neighbors protect their investments." The crowd began to murmur, sensing that the presentation had taken an unexpected turn toward personal conflict. I could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward me, though most people didn't yet understand what Orlando was implying. "My wife Bonnie, for example," Orlando said, gesturing toward me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "has been spending an unusual amount of time on her computer lately." long hours researching property records, municipal documents, and what she calls, quote, community journalism. But I'm concerned that her enthusiasm for investigation might be creating confusion and anxiety among our neighbors. I felt my chest tighten as Orlando began what I realized was a preemptive attack. Somehow he had discovered or suspected my investigation, and he was attempting to discredit me publicly before I could expose him. Mental health is a serious issue that affects many families in our community, Orlando continued, his voice taking on the concerned tone of someone reluctantly sharing difficult personal information. When someone becomes obsessed with conspiracy theories, when they start seeing patterns and connections that don't exist, when they begin accusing trusted community members of criminal behavior. The crowd was now completely focused on this unexpected personal drama unfolding on stage. I could see confusion and discomfort on faces throughout the audience, as neighbors tried to understand what they were witnessing. I've been hoping that Bonnie would seek professional help for what appears to be developing paranoid delusions, Orlando said, shaking his head sadly. But instead, she's been using her blog to spread misinformation and unfounded accusations that could damage innocent people's reputations and harm our community's stability. The betrayal was breathtaking in its cruelty and tactical brilliance. Orlando was attempting to destroy my credibility by painting me as mentally unstable, while simultaneously revealing that he knew about my investigation and was prepared to frame it as delusional conspiracy theories. In fact, Orlando continued, I'm concerned that Bonnie may be planning to disrupt tonight's gathering with some kind of outburst or dramatic scene designed to draw attention to her unfounded theories about imaginary criminal conspiracies. My phone showed 7:14 p.m., 1 minute until the newsletter's automatic publication, so I want everyone here to understand that if my wife attempts to interrupt tonight's proceedings, or if she tries to share wild accusations about financial fraud or criminal behavior, you're witnessing someone who desperately needs mental health intervention, not someone presenting credible information about our community. The crowd was now staring at me with a mixture of pity, curiosity, and concern. Orlando had successfully reframed my upcoming revelation as the ravings of an unstable woman having a public breakdown. Even if I presented compelling evidence, it would now be filtered through the lens of mental illness that he had just established. But Orlando's greatest mistake was underestimating the thoroughness of my preparation and the explosive nature of the evidence I had collected. Standing up from my seat in the front row, I looked directly at Orlando and smiled, the same calm, confident smile I had been practicing in the mirror for months. Thank you for that introduction, Orlando, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent pavilion. You're absolutely right that I've been investigating criminal behavior in our community. And you're correct that I've been preparing to share my findings tonight. I held up my phone, showing the recording that had been running throughout his entire presentation. But I think our neighbors deserve to hear both sides of this story before they decide who's telling the truth. Orlando's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty. This wasn't how he had expected me to respond. He had anticipated tears, denial, or a defensive breakdown that would confirm his mental illness narrative. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced to the crowd, my husband is right that I've been documenting criminal activity for the past 2 years. What he doesn't know is that I've been documenting his criminal activity. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. Orlando's face went pale, as he realized that his preemptive strike had backfired, giving me the perfect opening to begin my counterattack. At exactly 7:15 p.m., I continued, checking my phone, which is in 30 seconds, every subscriber to the Willowbrook Community Newsletter will receive a special edition containing over 3,000 pieces of evidence documenting the most sophisticated suburban fraud operation in our region's history. Orlando stepped away from the microphone, his confident demeanor cracking as he realized the scope of what was about to happen. The newsletter will detail how Orlando Arlington, along with his partners Marlon Holloway, Eric Sinclair, and Amber Holloway, have systematically defrauded at least 27 families in our community, stealing over $2 million through property manipulation, emotional exploitation, and psychological abuse. My phone showed 7:15 p.m. exactly, and it's publishing right now. Orlando's world was about to explode, and every person in our community would witness the detonation in real time. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. For 3 heartbeats, the entire pavilion seemed frozen in time, as neighbors processed what I had just said. Then the first phone began to chime with an email notification, followed by another, and another, until the gathering was filled with the sound of dozens of devices simultaneously receiving the Willowbrook Community Newsletter's special edition. Orlando stood paralyzed at the microphone, watching his audience transform from attentive community members into an increasingly agitated crowd of people, frantically checking their phones. The color had drained from his face completely, leaving him looking pale and slightly sick under the pavilion's bright lights. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely carrying over the growing murmur of shocked conversations. "Bonnie, what have you done?" I stepped closer to the stage, holding my phone up so the crowd could see that I was recording everything. "I've done exactly what any responsible journalist would do when they discover a criminal conspiracy operating in their community, Orlando. I've documented the evidence and shared it with the public." Tom Henderson was the first to speak up from the audience, his voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "Orlando, I'm looking at this newsletter right now, and it says you knew about my job loss 3 weeks before I was laid off. It says you manipulated my family into selling our house for $70,000 below market value." Orlando's carefully constructed composure was beginning to crack. "Tom, you have to understand, that's completely taken out of context. Bonnie she's been misinterpreting normal business communications." "Normal business communications?" I interrupted, pulling out my laptop and connecting it to the pavilion's projection system. "Let me share some of those normal communications with everyone here." The large screens that had been displaying Orlando's fake municipal development plans now showed the first page of evidence from my investigation. Orlando's own email, sent to Marlon Holloway 3 weeks before Tom's layoff, with the subject line, "Henderson target confirmed. Plant closure advance notice received." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as people read Orlando's words on the giant screens. "Tom H. will be unemployed within the month. Manufacturing plant closure not public for 3 weeks. Perfect timing to initiate financial pressure sequence. Eric can fabricate foundation issues. You handle mortgage complications. Should net us 60 to 80K profit margin." Tom Henderson stood up from his picnic table, his face flushed red with rage. "You son of a bitch. You knew I was going to lose my job, and you used that information to steal my house?" Orlando stepped away from the microphone, his hands raised in a gesture that was part surrender, part desperate attempt to maintain control. "Tom, please, let me explain. This is all being taken completely out of context. Bonnie has been manipulating these documents." "Manipulating?" I clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of Orlando's handwritten notes from his filing cabinet. "These are your own words, Orlando, written in your handwriting, detailing your Henderson manipulation timeline, with specific psychological pressure points and financial exploitation strategies." The crowd was now fully engaged, neighbors standing up from their seats to get better views of the screens, voices rising as people began recognizing their own situations in the evidence being presented. The comfortable community gathering had transformed into something approaching a lynch mob mentality. Rebecca Walsh's voice cut through the chaos, surprisingly strong for such an elderly woman. "Orlando, this newsletter says you convinced me to sell my house by lying about property tax increases that were never real. It says you made $15,000 in commission while I lost nearly $80,000 in equity." "Rebecca, please," Orlando started, but she wasn't finished. "It says you targeted me specifically because I was grieving my husband's death and vulnerable to manipulation. It says you kept psychological profiles on how to exploit widows and elderly homeowners." Her voice was shaking now, not with frailty but with fury. "You were at my husband's funeral, Orlando. You brought flowers to his grave with me, and all that time you were planning to steal from me?" I advanced to the next series of slides, showing Orlando's detailed victim profiles. The screens now displayed his clinical notes about Rebecca's, quote, grief, vulnerability, her isolation from family support, and his timeline for emotional dependency development. The crowd's mood was shifting from shock to outrage, as neighbors saw themselves reduced to clinical target assessments in Orlando's files. Parents covered their children's ears as the language in the documents became more explicitly manipulative and predatory. Jennifer Walsh stood up, her teenage daughter Ashley beside her. This says you seduced me specifically to break up my marriage and force a property sale. It says you documented our intimate conversations and kept recordings for blackmail purposes. Orlando tried to speak, but Jennifer's voice had grown stronger, carrying across the pavilion with devastating clarity. You destroyed my marriage. You destroyed my daughter's trust in relationships. You stole money from our divorce settlement. And you documented every step of it, like you were conducting some kind of sick scientific experiment. The screens now showed Orlando's seduction protocols, step-by-step instructions for identifying unhappy wives, exploiting their emotional needs, and manipulating them into affairs that would destabilize their marriages and create property sale opportunities. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying clearly over the increasingly angry crowd. "What you're seeing represents just the first section of over 3,000 pieces of evidence. We have bank records showing money laundering through shell companies. We have recordings of Orlando coordinating with corrupt city officials. We have documentation of at least 27 separate fraud cases totaling over $2 million in stolen equity." Orlando made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is all fabricated," he shouted into the microphone. "Bonnie has been having a mental breakdown. She's been creating fake documents and—" His words were drowned out by the sound of police sirens in the distance, growing louder as they approached the community park. The federal agents I had coordinated with were now moving through the crowd, no longer maintaining their cover as ordinary community members. Agent Rivera stepped onto the pavilion, badge clearly visible, and approached Orlando with practiced efficiency. "Orlando Arlington, you're under arrest for federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering." Orlando's legs seemed to give out as the reality of his situation finally hit him. The man who had controlled our community through manipulation and psychological warfare was now reduced to a trembling figure being read his rights in front of the very neighbors he had systematically victimized. But this was only the beginning of his downfall. The newsletter was still spreading across social media, news crews were broadcasting live from the scene, and every person Orlando had ever manipulated was about to learn exactly how they had been exploited by the man they had trusted most. As Orlando was being handcuffed on stage, I continued my methodical destruction of his criminal empire by displaying the evidence that would ensure he never walked free again. The pavilion screens now showed a comprehensive financial flowchart that traced money from victim properties through a complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fabricated business transactions. "What you're seeing here," I announced to the crowd of shocked neighbors and arriving news crews, "is a sophisticated money laundering operation that Orlando coordinated with his criminal network. Every fraudulent property transaction was processed through multiple companies designed to hide the illegal profits." The financial records painted a picture of criminal enterprise that exceeded anything our suburban community could have imagined. Orlando hadn't just been stealing from individual families. He had been operating a systematic wealth extraction scheme that treated our entire neighborhood as his personal ATM. Agent Rivera, who had just finished reading Orlando his rights, nodded to me to continue the presentation while his team secured the scene. The federal investigation had been building their own case for months, but my evidence had provided the comprehensive documentation they needed to ensure convictions for everyone involved. "Arlington Holdings, Willowbrook Investment Partners, and Maple Drive Development Corporation," I said, clicking through slides that showed business registration documents, "are all shell companies controlled by Orlando and his partners. They exist solely to purchase properties at below-market prices from families Orlando had manipulated into desperate sales situations." Rosa Martinez stepped forward from the crowd, her voice strong despite the cancer treatment she had endured. "Our house sold to Arlington Holdings." "Are you saying that was Orlando's company?" "Not just Orlando's," I replied, advancing to the next series of evidence slides. "The network includes Marlon Halloway, who provided predatory financing that trapped families in impossible situations, Eric Sinclair, who conducted fraudulent property inspections to create artificial emergencies, and Amber Holloway, who illegally accessed city planning documents to manufacture development threats." The screens now displayed detailed organizational charts showing how each member of the conspiracy played specific roles in the fraud scheme. Marlon would identify financially vulnerable families through his mortgage brokerage connections. Amber would provide inside information about city projects that could be twisted into property value threats. Eric would conduct fake inspections that created urgent repair needs. Orlando would coordinate the psychological manipulation that convinced families to sell quickly at reduced prices. The Martinez family's house, purchased by Arlington Holdings for $195,000, was resold 6 months later for $285,000, I continued. The $90,000 profit was split among the conspiracy members according to this detailed agreement I found in Orlando's files. Rosa's husband Carlos stepped beside his wife, his construction worker's hands clenched into fists. "We trusted you," he said, staring directly at Orlando, who was now sitting in the back of a police cruiser. "Rosa was fighting cancer, and we trusted you to help us avoid losing our home to medical debt. Instead, you created fake problems to steal our home for yourself." The evidence continued cascading across the screens as I revealed the full scope of the conspiracy's operations. Bank records showed systematic patterns of property acquisition, cosmetic improvement, and rapid resale that generated enormous profits for the criminal network. Tax documents revealed how the profits were hidden through legitimate business fronts and charitable donations that were actually payments to co-conspirators. The Henderson family's forced sale generated $68,000 in illegal profits, I announced, watching Tom Henderson's face as he processed the specific dollar amount that had been stolen from his family's future. The Walsh family's divorce settlement manipulation resulted in $47,000 in fraudulent commissions. Rebecca Walsh's widow exploitation netted the network $73,000. Each revelation sent fresh waves of outrage through the crowd, as neighbors calculated exactly how much money had been stolen from their community. The pavilion had become an impromptu courtroom, where 2 years of meticulous investigation was being presented as evidence of the most comprehensive suburban fraud scheme in regional history. But the financial crimes were only part of the conspiracy's devastating impact on our community. The screens now showed Orlando's psychological manipulation files, detailed profiles of every family in Willowbrook Estates that included financial information, relationship status, health concerns, employment stability, and psychological vulnerabilities. Orlando maintained what he called opportunity assessments on every household in our neighborhood, I explained, displaying pages of handwritten notes that revealed the clinical precision of his targeting strategies. He documented our children's activities, our medical appointments, our work schedules, and our marriage problems. Everything we shared as friends and neighbors was being cataloged as potential exploitation opportunities. Jennifer Walsh's daughter Ashley, now 17 and mature enough to understand the implications, spoke up with a voice that shook with rage. "You were watching our family fall apart, and instead of helping, you were taking notes on how to make it worse for your own profit?" The screens displayed Orlando's detailed timeline for Jennifer's seduction, complete with psychological assessments of her emotional vulnerabilities and strategic plans for destroying her marriage. The clinical language he used to describe intimate human relationships was so cold and predatory that several people in the crowd audibly gasped. Phase 1. Establish emotional dependency through sympathetic listening and validation of marriage concerns, I read from Orlando's notes. Phase 2. Introduce doubts about husband's commitment and long-term compatibility. Phase 3. Physical intimacy to create guilt and secrecy that increases emotional dependency. Phase 4. Convince subject that divorce is inevitable and property liquidation is necessary for financial security. The crowd was now completely silent except for the sound of people crying, some from rage, others from the devastating realization of how completely they had been manipulated by someone they considered a trusted friend. This systematic exploitation wasn't limited to property fraud, I continued. Orlando documented his sexual encounters with married women, kept photographs and recordings for blackmail purposes, and maintained detailed psychological profiles to ensure maximum emotional control over his victims. The evidence was overwhelming, comprehensive, and irrefutable. Orlando's own obsessive record-keeping had created a complete documentation of his criminal enterprise that would ensure conviction on multiple federal charges, including fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, extortion, and sexual exploitation. As news crews captured every moment of the revelation and social media spread the story beyond our community, Orlando's reputation wasn't just destroyed, It was obliterated so completely that he would never again be able to manipulate anyone who had access to the internet. The man who had spent years controlling others through information and psychological manipulation was about to discover what it felt like to have his own secrets exposed to the entire world. The moment had come for the revelation that would shock our community even more than Orlando's criminal exposure. As federal agents secured the scene and news crews captured every moment, I stepped fully into the spotlight to reveal the truth about who had been living among them for the past 2 years. Before we continue, I announced to the crowd, I need to share something that will help you understand how this investigation was possible. Many of you have been reading and sharing articles from the Willowbrook Community Newsletter for the past 2 years. You've relied on its investigative reporting, its municipal government coverage, and its exposure of local corruption. I paused, watching faces in the crowd as neighbors began to realize what I was about to reveal. I am the Willowbrook Community Newsletter, the anonymous journalist who has been investigating fraud and corruption throughout our region, the reporter who has broken 3 major municipal scandals, the writer whose work has been featured in regional newspapers and cited by federal investigators. That's me, Bonnie Arlington, the quiet graphic designer who smiles at block parties and brings cookies to new neighbors. The silence was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense the magnitude of what was being revealed. Tom Henderson was the first to speak, his voice filled with awe and confusion. You're saying that the newsletter that exposed the city council kickback scheme, the one that got 2 councilmen arrested last year, that was you? That investigation began when I discovered documents in Orlando's files showing how he was bribing city officials for advance information about development projects, I confirmed. Every major story the newsletter has broken started with evidence I gathered while investigating my own husband's criminal activities. I clicked to a new slide that showed the newsletter's subscriber statistics, media citations, and impact metrics. The newsletter now reaches over 15,000 readers across 7 communities. It has been quoted by the regional newspaper 43 times. Federal investigators have used our reporting as the foundation for 6 separate criminal cases. The crowd was processing this information with visible shock. The woman they had dismissed as Orlando's quiet, supportive wife had been operating as one of the region's most effective investigative journalists, working literally under the nose of the criminal she was exposing. But the newsletter was just my platform, I continued. My real work has been building the most comprehensive case file on suburban financial fraud that law enforcement has ever seen. I have been working directly with the FBI's white-collar crime division for 18 months, providing evidence that has led to tonight's arrests. Agent Rivera stepped forward to address the crowd directly. Mrs. Arlington's investigation and evidence collection has been extraordinary. Her work has enabled us to build federal cases against 4 individuals and trace criminal activity across multiple states. Without her dedication and expertise, this criminal network would have continued operating indefinitely. The revelation was recontextualizing everything our neighbors thought they knew about the past 2 years. Every community meeting where I had sat quietly while Orlando manipulated discussions, every social gathering where I had appeared to be the supportive wife, every conversation where I had seemed uninterested in complex financial topics, all of it had been cover for one of the most sophisticated undercover investigations in suburban history. The skills I developed during this investigation have been extraordinary, I continued. I taught myself forensic accounting, digital surveillance, legal research, and investigative journalism. I learned to read lips so I could understand Orlando's private phone conversations. I mastered lockpicking to access his filing cabinets. I became an expert in money laundering detection and psychological manipulation recognition. Rebecca Walsh stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. You mean that while Orlando was manipulating me into selling my house, you were documenting his crimes? You were gathering evidence that would eventually bring him to justice? I know how difficult this must be to understand, I replied. For 2 years, I watched Orlando destroy families while I collected evidence. I wanted to warn everyone, to stop him immediately, but I knew that without comprehensive proof, he would simply move his operations to another community and continue victimizing innocent people. The screens now displayed a timeline of my investigation, showing how evidence gathering had coincided with Orlando's major crimes. The audience could see that I had been documenting his manipulation of the Henderson family from the beginning, recording his exploitation of Rebecca Walsh as it happened, and tracking his seduction of Jennifer Walsh in real time. The reason I couldn't intervene directly was that Orlando and his network were too sophisticated for simple exposure, I explained. They had contingency plans, backup operations, and the ability to relocate their scheme if they suspected investigation. The only way to ensure they faced justice was to build a federal case so comprehensive that they couldn't escape or continue their crimes elsewhere. Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, her face showing a complex mixture of emotions. So when I was having the affair with Orlando, when I was confiding in you about my marriage problems, you knew he was manipulating me? I knew, and it was the most difficult aspect of this entire investigation, I replied honestly. I wanted to tell you the truth, but doing so would have compromised the larger case and potentially allowed Orlando to escape justice. I had to watch him destroy relationships and steal from families while maintaining my cover as his unsuspecting wife. The moral complexity of my position was evident to everyone present. I had been simultaneously victim and investigator, wife and undercover journalist, community member and federal informant. The ethical challenges of my situation were unprecedented in suburban crime investigation. What you accomplished is remarkable, Agent Rivera confirmed. Mrs. Arlington developed and executed an investigation that meets the highest standards of federal law enforcement. Her evidence collection, documentation methods, and operational security were exemplary. The crowd was now looking at me with a mixture of awe, confusion, and respect. The quiet woman they had known for 5 years had revealed herself to be one of the most effective crime fighters their community had ever seen. But the revelation wasn't complete. The screens now showed my plans for the future, how the skills and platform I had developed during this investigation would be used to help other communities facing similar predatory schemes. The truth was more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined, and Orlando was finally learning exactly who he had been living with for the past 2 years. The community park had transformed into a crime scene within minutes of my revelation. News trucks lined the parking area, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky as reporters prepared live broadcasts that would carry this story across the region. Social media was exploding, with shares of the newsletter turning Orlando's criminal empire into trending hashtags and viral content. My phone was buzzing constantly with notifications as the newsletter's special edition spread far beyond our local community. Regional newspapers were calling for interviews. Television producers were requesting exclusive access. Legal experts were commenting on the sophisticated nature of the evidence I had compiled. But the most immediate impact was happening right in front of me, as neighbors processed the complete reversal of everything they had believed about their community and the people living within it. Tom Henderson approached me with tears in his eyes. Bonnie, I don't know how to thank you. For 2 years, I've been blaming myself for losing our house, thinking I made stupid financial decisions that hurt my family. Now I know we were victims of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. Similar conversations were happening throughout the pavilion, as victims realized that their financial disasters hadn't been personal failures, but the result of systematic manipulation by someone they had trusted as a friend and advisor. Rosa Martinez embraced me, her voice strong despite the emotions. You gave us our dignity back. We thought we were stupid for falling for Orlando's lies. Now we know we were targeted by experts who had studied exactly how to exploit our vulnerabilities. The federal agents were coordinating the arrests of Orlando's co-conspirators in real time. Marlon Holloway had been taken into custody at his mortgage brokerage office. Eric Sinclair was arrested at his home as he attempted to destroy documents. Amber Holloway was apprehended at City Hall, where she had been trying to delete files from the municipal planning system. Agent Rivera provided updates to the crowd as each arrest was confirmed. The coordination you're witnessing tonight is the result of Mrs. Arlington's evidence enabling us to execute simultaneous warrants across multiple jurisdictions. This level of preparation ensures that none of the conspirators can escape or destroy additional evidence. The news crews were capturing emotional reactions from victims as they learned the truth about their situations. Jennifer Walsh gave a powerful interview about the psychological manipulation she had endured, while her daughter Ashley spoke about the impact on children whose families had been destroyed by Orlando's schemes. The hardest part was blaming my parents for our family falling apart, Ashley said to the cameras. I thought their divorce was my fault somehow. Learning that it was orchestrated by a predator who documented every step of destroying our family changes everything. Local television stations were already preparing special investigative reports based on the newsletter's evidence. The regional newspaper had assigned a team of reporters to develop comprehensive coverage of what they were calling, quote, the most sophisticated suburban fraud case in state history. But perhaps the most significant immediate impact was the sense of community solidarity that was forming among Orlando's victims. Families who had been isolated in their shame and financial stress were now connecting with others who had experienced identical manipulation tactics. Rebecca Walsh was speaking with the Martinez family about forming a victim support group. Tom Henderson was comparing experiences with other families who had been pressured into desperate property sales. Jennifer Walsh was discussing the psychological recovery process with other women who had been manipulated through fake romantic relationships. My phone showed dozens of messages from other communities asking if I would investigate similar suspicious activity in their neighborhoods. Law enforcement agencies were requesting copies of my investigation methods and evidence organization techniques. The quiet suburban barbecue had become ground zero for what legal experts were already calling a landmark case in consumer fraud prosecution. And at the center of it all sat Orlando, visible through the police cruiser window, finally understanding that his greatest victim had become his most devastating opponent. 6 months after the barbecue that changed everything, the full scope of Orlando's downfall had reached proportions that even I hadn't anticipated. What began as a neighborhood confrontation had evolved into a federal case study that was reshaping how law enforcement approaches suburban financial crimes nationwide. Orlando Arlington was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The judge called his crimes a systematic assault on the fundamental trust that holds communities together, and noted that the sophistication of his psychological manipulation warranted the maximum sentence under federal fraud statutes. Marlon Holloway received 22 years for his role in the predatory lending schemes. Eric Sinclair was sentenced to 15 years for property inspection fraud and conspiracy. Amber Holloway, who cooperated with investigators and provided additional evidence about municipal corruption, received 8 years and was permanently barred from public employment. The financial restitution ordered by the court exceeded $3 million when investigators traced the full extent of the network's criminal profits. Every family Orlando had victimized received compensation that not only covered their losses, but included punitive damages for the psychological trauma they had endured. Tom Henderson used his restitution payment to purchase a home in Willowbrook Estates that was actually larger than the one Orlando had stolen from his family. "It's not about the money," he told the regional newspaper. "It's about getting our lives back and knowing that predators like Orlando can't destroy families without consequences." Rebecca Walsh established a foundation for elderly fraud victims using her settlement funds. At 74, she had become a national advocate for senior protection legislation, testifying before Congress about the sophisticated methods criminals use to exploit vulnerable populations. The Martinez family's restitution enabled them to secure Rosa's ongoing cancer treatment at a specialized facility, while also establishing college funds for their daughters. Rosa had become a spokesperson for medical fraud victim advocacy, helping other families recognize manipulation tactics used against people facing health crises. But the consequences extended far beyond individual victim compensation. The Orlando Arlington case had triggered a comprehensive review of real estate fraud detection methods by federal regulators. New laws required enhanced disclosure of potential conflicts of interest in property transactions, mandatory cooling-off periods for distressed sales, and increased penalties for professionals who exploit client relationships. The Willowbrook Community Newsletter had evolved into a nationally recognized platform for investigative journalism, focusing on suburban financial crimes. I now receive tips from communities across the country about suspicious property manipulation schemes, and federal investigators regularly consulted with me about evidence collection techniques in similar cases. My investigation methods had been adopted by law enforcement agencies in 12 states, and I was frequently invited to speak at conferences about undercover investigation strategies and community-based fraud detection. What started as a desperate attempt to document my husband's crimes had become a blueprint for exposing sophisticated criminal networks operating in suburban communities. The psychological impact on Orlando himself was perhaps the most complete aspect of his destruction. In prison, he was known as the, quote, suburban predator, whose crimes had been documented in exhaustive detail and shared with millions of people online. His manipulation techniques had been so thoroughly exposed that he could never again rely on charm or deception to control others. Prison officials reported that Orlando struggled severely with his new reality, a world where everyone knew exactly who he was and what he had done. The man who had controlled others through information and psychological manipulation was now completely powerless, his every move monitored, and his reputation permanently destroyed. The community of Willowbrook Estates had been transformed as well. Property values had actually increased after Orlando's arrest, as potential buyers recognized the neighborhood's commitment to rooting out corruption and protecting residents from predatory schemes. The annual barbecue had become a celebration of community vigilance and mutual protection. Most importantly, Orlando's victims had reclaimed their dignity and financial security, while helping to create systems that would protect future families from similar exploitation. The quiet wife who had been dismissed as irrelevant had become the architect of justice that would protect countless others from the predators who see suburban communities as hunting grounds for financial exploitation. 2 years after that transformative barbecue, I stood in my new home office, looking out at a view that would have been impossible to imagine during the darkest days of my investigation. The converted barn on my property housed what had become the National Center for Suburban Financial Crime Prevention, a nonprofit organization that had grown from my newsletter into a comprehensive resource for communities facing predatory schemes. The space buzzed with activity as my team of investigators, legal analysts, and victim advocates worked on cases from across the country. What had begun as one woman's desperate attempt to document her husband's crimes had evolved into a movement that was transforming how America protects its suburban communities from financial predators. My personal transformation had been equally dramatic. The quiet graphic designer who once deferred to her husband's expertise on financial matters now testified regularly before Congress, consulted with federal agencies, and was frequently quoted in national media as an expert on suburban fraud prevention. Universities invited me to lecture on investigative journalism and community-based crime prevention, but the most meaningful change was in how I related to the community that had become my second family. The victims of Orlando's schemes had formed bonds that transcended their shared trauma, creating a support network that helped other families navigate similar situations. We met monthly, not as victims anymore, but as advocates and educators who could recognize predatory behavior and protect others from exploitation. Tom Henderson had become the president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association, implementing policies that required transparency in all property transactions and mandated disclosure of any financial relationships between community members and real estate professionals. His experience with Orlando's manipulation had made him an expert at identifying the early warning signs of property fraud. Rebecca Walsh, now 76, traveled extensively speaking to senior communities about financial exploitation prevention. Her foundation had helped over 300 elderly victims recover stolen assets and had successfully lobbied for stronger protections for vulnerable populations in real estate transactions. The Martinez family had thrived in ways that extended far beyond financial recovery. Rosa's successful cancer treatment had given her a platform to advocate for medical fraud victim protection, while her daughters, now teenagers, had become active in youth financial literacy programs that taught young people to recognize manipulation tactics. Jennifer Walsh had returned to school to become a licensed therapist, specializing in recovery from psychological manipulation. Her daughter Ashley, now in college studying criminal justice, credited her family's experience with Orlando as inspiration for her career, dedicated to protecting vulnerable people from predators. My own romantic life had also been transformed. I was engaged to Detective Michael Chen, one of the federal investigators who had worked on Orlando's case. Our relationship was built on mutual respect for each other's professional expertise and a shared commitment to justice that made our partnership both personal and professional. The annual Willowbrook Barbecue had become a celebration that drew visitors from across the region. Families came to learn about community-based fraud prevention, and law enforcement agencies sent representatives to observe our model of neighborhood vigilance and mutual protection. What had once been Orlando's favorite manipulation opportunity was now a symbol of community strength and resilience. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation skills I had developed during those difficult years had become tools for empowerment rather than survival. I no longer worked in secret, gathering evidence in fear and isolation. Instead, I collaborated openly with communities, law enforcement, and policymakers to create systems that protected families before they became victims. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as irrelevant by her predatory husband had become a voice that commanded national attention and respect. The skills I had developed to survive Orlando's manipulation had been transformed into expertise that protected countless others from similar exploitation. Every morning when I arrived at my office, I was reminded that the worst experience of my life had become the foundation for the most meaningful work I could imagine. Orlando had tried to steal my dignity, my security, and my future. Instead, he had unknowingly created the circumstances that would transform me into someone far more powerful than he could ever have become. Let me speak directly to you now, because there are things I've learned that might change your life the way they changed mine. If you're in a relationship where someone controls information, makes you doubt your own intelligence, or dismisses your concerns as overreaction, trust your instincts. Your gut feelings about manipulation are usually right, even when you can't prove it yet. The person who underestimates you the most might be living in your own home. Orlando saw me as decoration, as someone too simple to understand complex financial matters. That blindness became his greatest weakness. If someone in your life treats you as less intelligent than you are, they're giving you an invisible advantage that you can use to protect yourself and others. Document everything, but do it safely. I learned forensic accounting, digital security, and investigation techniques because I had to. You don't need to become an expert overnight, but you can start paying attention differently. Screenshots, photographs, written records. Evidence is power, but only if you collect it systematically and store it securely. Your community is your strength. The isolation that predators create is artificial. When I revealed the truth about Orlando, I discovered that almost every family had been targeted or manipulated in some way. The shame that keeps victims silent is exactly what allows predators to continue operating. Breaking that silence protects everyone. Skills you develop during your worst experiences can become tools for your greatest achievements. I never wanted to learn about financial fraud or psychological manipulation. But those skills I developed to survive Orlando's abuse became the foundation for work that has protected thousands of families. Your survival strategies might be preparing you for something more meaningful than you can imagine right now. You are more capable than anyone who tries to control you wants you to believe. The investigation I conducted was more sophisticated than anything Orlando ever imagined I could accomplish. The newsletter I built reached more people than he influenced in his entire criminal career. The evidence I collected was more comprehensive than what many professional investigators compile. If I could do that while living with my target, you can do extraordinary things when you decide to fight back. Most importantly, your story matters. Every person who has been manipulated, controlled, or underestimated has insights that could help others recognize similar situations. Your experience with predatory behavior makes you an expert that others need to hear from. The quiet ones, the dismissed ones, the underestimated ones. We're often the most dangerous opponents because no one sees us coming. If someone in your life has made the mistake of underestimating your intelligence, your strength, or your determination, they've given you the perfect opportunity to prove them wrong in ways they'll never recover from. Your power is real. Use it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.